Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on feedback as a feature, embedding user insight into your documentation process. I'm Sheba, your co-host for tonight. Now I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, Rachel Rigdon. Rachel is a lead technical writer at SailPoint, bringing 10 years of expertise in docs as code, user-centered documentation, and mentoring fellow writers. She's here today to share how SailPoint successfully built a scalable, feedback-driven documentation process and how you can implement the same approach in your own work. And now I'll hand it over to Rachel. The stage is all yours.
Thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate it. So I'm very excited today to share some about what we have learned at SailPoint about trying to effectively gather and use user feedback in our documentation strategy. So I'm going to start off with talking about why user feedback is important in the first place. And then we're going to talk about first how to gather user feedback, right? Before you can actually embed it, you have to have a mechanism for effectively gathering user feedback. So we're going to look at some methods and some different implementation attempts that we've tried at SailPoint and the challenges we run into them so that you can be aware of some of the issues and concerns that you might want to be cognizant of as you're making your decisions for a feedback mechanism. I'm going to share a very short demo of the solution that we've created here and describe how the choices we've made at each step are intended to address some of the challenges and frustrations we've experienced in past attempts. And then I'm going to show you some guidance and examples of how we've been able to effectively embed user feedback and hopefully give you some takeaways that will benefit your org as you are deciding how and when you want to implement a user feedback system. All right, so let's get started. First of all, why is user feedback worth pursuing in the first place? Why is it something that we value as tech writers and want to be able to implement in our docs strategy? Well, I think first of all, we know that as writers, a lot of times we stand in for the user. We are the user by proxy, by going through the product and trying to understand it, by testing APIs. We are embodying the role that the user is also going to have to take. But it's hard to get data on that and really back it up. And we all know that data is more compelling than vibes. People are just going to respond better to that. So when you're able to effectively gather user feedback and understand it, it can give you a lot of benefits, right? It can improve the insights that writers are able to bring to product development, be able to provide a little bit more nuance and understanding of where users might get stuck, so then you can provide better insight and guidance. It can also help determine what your information architecture strategy should be, right? The better ways that you can understand how users are engaging with your documentation and the product, the better decisions you can make around how you're going to package, present, and structure the content. And lastly, and probably most importantly, is that it deepens empathy. Empathy is such a critical skill for a tech writer, and that being user-centric and customer-centric is just so critical, right? And so the deeper your empathy and the better you can understand your user, the better you're going to be able to apply that empathy to your documentation strategy. But not all user feedback is created equal. And depending on the method you choose and the systems you set up, sometimes what you get can be about as useful as this admittedly delightful classic taunt. And while we have not gotten that specific comment, we have gotten a mix of comments that haven't been very high quality in our past implementations. So when we're talking about user feedback, what we're really looking for is high quality user feedback. And this is feedback that is relevant to the content at hand. It's actionable. We can actually do something to have an intervention based off of that feedback in a way that is going to improve the documentation. And if we're really fortunate, we have good systems in place and good processes, maybe we can also get feedback that will improve the product and maybe even the org. All right, so we know user feedback is important, but then how do we get it, right? That's the challenge of how do we actually gather user feedback? Well, over about a 6.5-year period, SailPoint didn't really have a feedback mechanism. We had kind of a different melange of things that we were testing, but none of them quite worked. And here's some of the feedback methods that we attempted to implement. We had our docs in a community platform at one point and found that having documentation that's the warranty of the product alongside user-generated content could introduce some confusion or risk. And we also had felt that it increased some of our dependencies on other teams that might not be able to support us in different initiatives that we were trying to accomplish. We also ran into similar challenges with more technical implementations like a ServiceNow integration with the support team and an incentive program also for the support team. And what we discovered was that that led to a high volume of kind of trivial tickets because our goals really didn't align with that incentive program and what we needed for documentation. We also tried kind of a lower, more kind of like basic option of the is this helpful, thumbs up, thumbs down. I actually put in the feature request for that, the MK Docs material repo, but we decided not to implement it because ultimately we weren't sure what is this, how much of this is performative versus actually productive. We also tried some lower tech, more kind of labor intensive things like form surveys and interviews, customer calls, and a shared email box. And we just ran into challenges across the board with, limited follow up or heavy time investment or kind of generic and unactionable feedback that wasn't very clear who the owner of that response would be, like which writer should actually make the change and respond to the user. So from all of these, 6.5 years of different methods that we attempted, what we really came away from that experience with is understanding the components of a successful program. So whatever feedback method you decide to implement, some of the ones that we tried could be beneficial for your org. They just didn't work for us. Whatever you choose, these are the components you need to think about. It's critical that the comments are closely coupled with the content. For example, in the shared email inbox, people would just leave comment like the docs are confusing or, this topic is unclear. But it was challenging to know what specifically we needed to address and fix because it was just kind of generic and unactionable. So when you have comments closely coupled with the content, that can help give you very specific constructive feedback. And I think, one of the comments on the poll, one of the options was how to train users to give you good feedback. That's one of the ways is by having a good method and system to allow them to have the content and the comment very closely together. You also need robust notifications and triage options, right? It's a terrible experience for a user to leave a comment and it linger for 6 months because no one was notified. And it's also critical that there's clear ownership, that the writer with the greatest expertise and knowledge of that area is the one who is responsible for responding to users. They're going to know the best way to intervene and take action. It's also critical to have partners with shared goals and priorities. It's a challenge when, we all know we're all busy. We all have different priorities and things that we're working on. And when you're able to find a team that has shared priorities, shared goals, that can be very productive. And that's true for any project you're trying to run. But especially once you start being more customer facing and trying to gather user feedback, it's really helpful to have consistent support from a team that's going to be able to give you help on integrations and initiatives and all the things that you might need. And then lastly, you also need to have a mature org and a good level of subject matter expertise, like I mentioned. You need to make sure that your org is mature enough to handle user feedback. The product is ready, right? If it's a pretty immature young product, it might not be ready to really be able to respond to user feedback. And you also need to make sure your docs team is ready. So let's dig into 3 main ways that you need to prepare to gather user feedback, 3 things that you really need to keep in mind. So based off of what we know about a successful program, the components that you need. First thing you're going to do is look for opportunities, look for partnerships, but always prioritize the maturity of your org. It's also critical that you're considering team dynamics and the risk tolerance and comfort levels of the writing team before you start making them more customer facing. And lastly, whatever solution you create, whatever combination of process, tech, and partnership that you come up with, it needs to be built around evaluation, acknowledgement, action, and closing the loop. So first of all, prioritize maturity. The first question you have to ask before you can even begin thinking about gathering user feedback is your org ready? Right? Is the product ready to receive user feedback? And are the engineering teams and product teams ready to support you? Because it's not enough to just get user feedback. That's kind of easy. What the challenge is being able to work with other teams internally to make changes to the docs, to the product, to organizational structures, whatever you end up getting out of that user feedback that you can leverage. So you need to make sure you're going to have that support. And then, of course, you have to make sure your docs team is ready. Do you have sufficient resources to be able to answer a bunch of questions, to be able to set up a doc program and maintain it in the future? And if your docs aren't very high quality, maybe, they're new, they're from a migration, they're kind of messy, exposing them to user comments might not be the best experience. It could help you know where to target your improvements, especially if you know it needs a lot of improvements, but it could also lead to kind of the same experience of just giving someone an unfinished draft. So you really want to make sure that you're prioritizing maturity on the resourcing and the doc quality as you're trying to prepare to gather user feedback. And in that process, always prioritize team development, because the greater the maturity of your doc team and their subject matter expertise, the better they will be able to gather and use that user feedback in a meaningful way to affect change in the docs, the product, and the org. As I mentioned, it's also important to consider team dynamics. A lot of us are writers because we don't necessarily want to be customer facing. We don't want to be support. And, it's kind of comforting to be a little bit more removed. And so when you start moving writers into a more customer facing role, when they start dealing with user feedback more directly, it's really critical that you are preparing in a way that's going to make everyone feel involved and heard, that you address comfort levels and risk tolerance, and you build processes in place to be able to ensure the writers feel supported and protected in these interactions. Make sure that you listen to and manage those concerns, and you're really trying to bring any of those anxieties or past experiences into your decisions. This was really important for us at SailPoint, right? Because we had 6.5 years of not a lot of success. And so there were a lot of concerns that we had to keep in mind. And it's just a helpful thing for any team. It's also critical to think about the approach that your doc team has. So we have a very expansive kind of investigative approach. Our docs are the warranty of the product, so we are responsible for validating and verifying our documentation regularly. And that investigative approach is really helpful because it allows you to dig into what a customer might be asking, understand it, and then know the correct action to take. So if you have a team that might not have that investigative approach quite yet, maybe if you're a writer and you're still working on that, that is a really good area to target so that when you are ready to gather user feedback, you're already going to have a strong skill set in place to be able to use it effectively. And that kind of follows up, right? Good subject matter expertise. The better you know the product, the better you know the org, the more effective you're going to be at understanding and responding to users. And kind of the last thing you want to keep in mind as you're preparing to gather user feedback is that you need to build on 4 principles. Evaluation, understanding what the user is actually asking, what they need from this interaction, acknowledging them, letting them know, hey, you've been heard, we're going to look into your feedback. Taking action, whatever that action is, if it's redirecting to the correct place, making a doc update, surfacing to the product team, whatever that action is, you then close the loop, let the user know what took place as a result of their feedback. All right. So we talked about why user feedback is important, and we've also addressed some of the different methods that you can keep in mind and that you can try, and then the principles you want to keep in mind as you're preparing to gather user feedback. I want to share some about the successful program we built here at SailPoint so that I can kind of show you how we try to address some of those challenges run into the past. How do we deal with unactionable and generic feedback? So just a quick timeline. I had a coffee chat last year with the head of developer relations, Jordan Violet, and he was telling me about this phenomenal community that the developer relations team had built. It was built on a forum software called Discourse, and they have a group of incentivized users called ambassadors. And these are kind of like super users who are very deeply engaged with the product, sometimes consultants, partners, and they get benefits for engaging in the community and in other areas of SailPoint activity. And he said that there was a desire to engage more with documentation, that sometimes it would be leaving comments about documentation, but it would be in this space, and it was difficult for that to be bubbled up to us that we could make changes. So this was really exciting to hear because, as I mentioned, spent 6.5 years trying to find the right fit. And so I took this proposal to the writers because it was very important to make sure that I was, again, taking their concerns into consideration. This is especially true because we had tried a community platform before. We had tried partnering with customer-facing teams, and we had tried an incentive program, and those had all fizzled. They just hadn't been successful for us. So we wanted to make sure that we were very thoughtful as we went into this process, being able to take into account what we experienced in the past to make this successful. Because of that, we were able to form a team and move pretty quickly to be able to work through a whole lot of technical and process issues to be able to launch on 7,500 doc pages within 6 months. And this is what the technical process looks like. And I'm going to just highlight the choices we made to make sure that this was a successful program that had those components. Whenever a writer publishes a doc, a topic is created over in Discourse, that forum software, and it has a little excerpt of the doc so that whenever their user comments, it's right there next to it, right, closely coupled. The topic is automatically categorized, so we know which writing team it goes to. We have 16 writers across 2 teams that participate in this program. It's categorized which writing team, and it's tagged with the actual doc set. That way we know if it has search docs, it goes to Rebecca. If it has config hub, it goes to Stacy. And this ensures that the correct writer is notified when a user comments. Once they get that notification, they don't have to worry about what other subject areas are getting comments, only theirs, so that we are able to get around that everybody's looking, nobody's looking situation we ran into with the shared email inbox. And then it also ensures that the writer with the greatest subject matter expertise is the one evaluating the request and trying to really understand what the user needs. And we discovered that this step was actually one of the more challenging steps, and we had to build in a lot of additional processes to support the writers in this evaluation step. And I'm going to share some details about what that looks like and how you can implement it in your own org. We were able to get some custom integrations from the discourse team to be able to create a JIRA ticket straight from the topic. And then we were able to take action, whatever that action is, and then close the loop, let the user know, hey, we were able to support you. So that JIRA ticket allows for successful triage, and we have successful notifications. And all of these steps that we took are intended to make it easier to have that successful program and get around the challenges we've run into in the past. And this is what it looks like. You can go to any of our doc pages and choose to leave a comment. It's going to take you over to our developer community where you can log in, and then you can leave a comment, and you'll see that this is related to a single doc. And I can see like, hey, Bianca has a very specific question, and I know the exact intervention I need to take to be able to support them. And it's been really successful. In about a little over a year, we have had 239 comments generated out of 867 comments. You can see that there's an almost even split. 21% of our comments come from ambassadors. Those are our incentivized users that get benefits for commenting. But 20% of our comments come from first-time commenters. This means that these people went to a doc page, they decided they wanted to leave a comment, they went over to our developer community, created an account just to leave a comment. And this shows that we're driving engagement into the community and being good partners to our developer relations team. We're helping people get into the community and be engaged. It's also really nice to see that we're capturing our super users, our most expert users, but we're also getting users that are new to the forum, that are new to the community, and might be newer to our product. And these are some of the really wonderful interactions we've had that shows that we have been able to be successful. Here we have an example where Josh really embodied those ideals of evaluation, acknowledgement, action, and closing the loop, and showed Henrik that it pays off to comment, right? I'd love to hear a user say, hey, it pays off to comment, look at this. And that's kind of reiterated by one of our other users, Jeff, who has been a really great contributor. And he was saying that the model that we have here, where we come in and like, hey, thank you for leaving this comment, we're going to take a look at it. That allows them to feel greater gratification and know that we are there to support them. And that greater gratification also leads to continued engagement, right? So when you close the loop, we talked about the importance of evaluation and acknowledgement, about taking the action and closing the loop. This leads to constructive contribution. So again, kind of training your writers to be good contributors to your org and to your docs. Then this helps that when you are following those principles, because here again, Jeff is saying that he doesn't want to just tell us it's broken, he wants to give guidance. And so when we come in and acknowledge, like, thank you so much for letting us know, that adds a next level piece that makes him want to come back and continue engaging in the docs. All right, quick pause. What if you don't have a community, right? What if you don't have a group of incentivized users like ambassadors or developer relations community? What if that's not what you have at your org? Well, you can still get user feedback effectively, especially if you keep those 4 principles of evaluation, action, acknowledgement, closing the loop, those 4. But there might be some limitations that you're going to need to keep in mind. So first of all, identify what tech you do have available to you. We know that the software that you use has an impact on what you are able to accomplish. And forum software is explicitly intended to help with responsiveness and building conversations. But if you don't have that, try to find customer-facing teams and build partnerships with them and identify what tech they are using to see if there's anything that you can kind of glom onto, so to speak, that you can participate in. You'll also have to lean more heavily on manual process if you don't have a software that's able to kind of automatically do categorization or tagging or things like that. And more manual processes means you're still going to have a pretty high level of maturity for your doc org. That's still going to be a prerequisite to be able to be successful, especially if you need to lean on manual process. It's also critical to set expectations. This is true for any project, but if you know that you're not going to have the software to support some of the different kind of flows of notifications, triage, things like that, you're just going to need to set expectations internally and externally of SLAs, how quickly you can respond and what those responses might be able to cover and entail. And then lastly, look for opportunities to remix and revise. Even with a very successful program like we have at SailPoint, we are continuing to look for new ways to understand how our users use our product and our documentation. For example, my colleague Bav is currently working with support to make it so that whenever they create an article in their KB, their knowledge base, out of a conversation with a customer, that is bubbled up to us, and we evaluate it to determine if it needs to also be added to the documentation. This ensures we have a holistic view and documentation. Makes it easier for a support team to be able to just drop doc links in the future. It helps us understand where users are getting stuck, and it builds more connections and partnerships between different teams. And that's something that's not reliant on a community at all. So there are multiple ways that you can still understand what your users are doing and where they're getting stuck that don't rely on a community. All right, so we talked about how to gather, the importance of documentation, how to gather, showing you some of the choices we've made to be effective at that. Now I want to talk about how to embed user feedback once you've gotten it, once you have methods in place that elicit constructive feedback. There are three main things that you want to keep in mind once you actually have the content. First, you need to make sure that you're supporting that evaluation step for the writers. That, I mentioned, is kind of the trickier part. You're going to want to make sure that that is supported. You also want to make sure that you're managing the concerns of the writers. This feeds back into managing, thinking about your team dynamics. That needs to continue once you're getting user feedback in place as the program continues. And then also making sure that you're minding the gap. A lot of times you're going to get comments that aren't necessarily about gaps in the documentation. They might be about gaps in the product or even in the org. And those are opportunities for you as a doc writer to be able to surface these concerns to the teams that are able to make those interventions at the product org level. You can show the participation and value that you have in making the product better. All right, so let's dig into how you can support those 3 points. The first is to realize that evaluation is an art. The comments we get are not just commas and links. And if you have a good feedback system and method to elicit comments, you're hopefully going to get comments that aren't just commas and links. They'll be engaged and specific. But that requires you to spend some time evaluating and understanding it, right? You have to ask, is this actually about docs, the product or the org or something else? And if it's about the product, whose product? I write for third-party docs all the time. And so third-party products, right? And so sometimes when a question comes in, I'm like, is this about Google Cloud Platform, AWS, or a SailPoint product? And I have to be able to understand where my role ends and begins. And I've mentioned this a few times, subject matter expertise is key. Being able to understand the subject area well enough to evaluate the user's comment is critical. Sometimes I'll triage the writer's tickets and I don't have the expertise in that area to be super effective at it. And so we just let the writers, they know their stuff, they know their topic, and they are completely in charge of that area and evaluating it because they know best. And the different doc types that you have will also elicit different feedback challenges, right? So we kind of call this like the users being in the wrong place, that if they're leaving a comment on a doc topic, but it's not actually about documentation, they're in the wrong place. And the type of docs tend to elicit kind of similarly, maybe off-topic comments. So for example, our integration docs, because they're working with third-party products, will get questions about those products that we don't know, or about custom integrations that we can't really support on the doc side because they're unique to that customer's org. Over on the feature side, which is where I live, we'll get questions about roadmaps or feature requests or complaints, things that they want changed. And we have to make sure that as doc writers, we have really clear kind of boundaries and expectations around what we can support and what we can do. We want to make sure that users are getting all the help they need, but we also have to recognize that as writers, we have boundaries. So the way that you can help enforce those boundaries and support the writers in their evaluation process is, first of all, to make sure that you have early engagement from PMs and devs. We found that there are just some doc areas, there are some tech areas that we just need them in immediately. We don't need for the writer to be the main point of contact. And that kind of goes hand in hand with making sure there's greater org awareness about this program. This ensures that when a writer goes to a PM or a dev with a question, they understand that this question might be from a Henrik, a Jeff, or one of our other very active users, and that we always want them to be responsive to us whenever we ask questions, but we also know that when it's from a customer, it kind of raises the profile a little bit more. So making sure that org understands that your writers have moved into a more customer-facing role with the user feedback system is really helpful. We also decided to tap into some official workflows for customer-facing needs, and that's been really beneficial. I mentioned that we have a kind of an investigative approach, but we discovered that the writers are spending a fair amount of time and their investigative skill set on evaluating and understanding the comments. And we really wanted to make sure that the investigative skills were applied to validating the documentation and following up on that, rather than trying to find the right Slack channel or that dev that seems to know everything. So this means that the writers can go to one single place and post their question from the user there, and then it is triaged by our BizOps team, right? So we get additional triage support internally that is able to raise the profile and ensure that we get PM and dev responsiveness on these questions without having to go all over the place. We also ensure that we have sample responses. We call them scripts, but they're really just we knew there were going to be standard scenarios of where users might be in the right place or the wrong place, and we wanted to make it easy for the writers to know how to respond to all of these different situations. And it would not be a talk about tech writing in the 2020s if we did not talk about AI and how we can leverage AI to also support with evaluation and responding to users. So I'm going to dig into these bottom two a little bit more. So sample responses, these are really helpful for any feedback program that you would like to create, because they create a very nice structured way for the writers to know how to respond to different scenarios that are common. So here are two examples. We actually have a ton of sample responses that we use, where the situation in the top is they're in the right place. This is about docs, and it's something that we can actually do. So we'll say like, hey, thank you for your input. We're going to look into your feedback and we'll update you when this thread is completed. Or we'll update this thread when that review is completed. That way the user knows they've been acknowledged. We're going to evaluate the question. We're looking into it. And we're going to close the loop. We're going to come back and let you know what action we took. That bottom one is an example of when they're in the wrong place, when they want help on doing something, but it's not really about documentation. And so we might say like, hey, this appears to be related to using the product features. So we're going to move you over to this other category in the community where you can get greater help from the community. And this is another benefit of working within a community structure and platform, is that we are able to kind of redirect some of these conversations that aren't really about docs. They aren't really about the topic that they're commenting on. It might be about something they want the product to do or some change. And so moving them over to a category where they can talk with other members of the community and get help there, maybe on their custom configurations or questions about those third-party products, that ensures that docs are still part of the process of helping our users be successful, even if we're saying this is really out of our purview. We can't support this particular use case, but we can help you get to the people that will support you. And I mentioned we have a lot of these kind of standard responses for when we see recurring situations come up. We create these so that it makes it easier on the writers and ensures that any future writers that come in, they have a nice kind of script that they can follow and tweak to be appropriate and personable in that moment. But that kind of cuts down some of the friction and stress of the evaluation process. And then AI, of course. So we do have an AI agent in our developer community that is trained on our documentation and our style guide. And so it provides almost like a federated search to be able to see across all of our docs what content is there. And sometimes when we get really involved, complex, long questions or a bunch of questions kind of bundled into one, what we can do is we can feed it into this AI agent. It's named Commander Data because we are dorks and like Star Trek. But we will run it through Commander Data and be like, hey, can you identify the questions in this comment? And what resources would you reference to find the answers to this question? So that if there is something in the documentation that can already address this, then it'll help us find it. And sometimes if it comes out with some good stuff that we know is there, we can ask it to help draft a response answering this question based on that information that we can then edit to make appropriate for the situation. So this allows us to be able to leverage some new technology and streamline again that evaluation process that can take a little bit more time and be a little trickier. All right. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about managing concerns. Writers can be an anxious bunch, including me in that group. And when you're working with customers, moving into a more customer-facing role, the stakes are higher, and that leads to higher anxiety, right? Those interactions when you're working with a customer have greater concern than when you're just talking to Joe, the dev who knows everything internally, right? So knowing that that's going to increase the anxiety in the team and making sure that you are managing those concerns and supporting those concerns through process and just different methods. One thing that we've run into is kind of the feeling on the hook, because the user doesn't know all of that investigative work that we're doing on the back end. They don't know the comments we're posting and the meetings we're having, trying to verify and validate. And that can make us feel a little on the hook, where we're like, hey, we're looking into this, and then the user doesn't know everything we're doing over here. And so managing that anxiety, manage those concerns, the sample responses really help with that, because it takes away some of that anxiety of responding to every single comment. But it is something that you need to kind of keep in mind and continually manage and support. And then We also know that getting feedback in general can feel icky. We experience this as writers. I've been doing this for 10 years, been professionally writing for even longer, and I will still get feedback on something I've written sometimes, and it can be great feedback that I'm absolutely going to take, and I can still feel icky that I needed it, you know? As writers, we have to kind of build a tolerance to that frustration and anxiety and feeling anyway, like all the time. But acknowledging that sometimes feedback can feel icky when you're getting it, whether from a customer or from another writer, and you just have to kind of practice some mindfulness, let that move on, and just really focus on the question at hand. But of course, you need to have clear escalation processes in place in case a user does become abusive. We have been very fortunate. We have not run into situations like this, but we do have very clear policies in place that if there is an interaction that's going sideways, we have people that can support, and the writer can be like, I'm out. I'm going to hand this over to the next person that can escalate and manage this. This ensures the writers feel a little bit more supported. It's very critical, and that we have support to ensure that comments are constructive and beneficial. And I also want to share a few tips that I got from someone in support. I asked them, like, how do you manage some of the kind of frustrations and challenges that come from working with customers? And I don't necessarily mean just working with frustrated customers, although it's definitely a component, because by the time customers get to our documentation, they're already a little frustrated that they couldn't figure it out on their own, that it wasn't entirely intuitive. And so understanding that we're getting customers that are already a little frustrated that they're with us in the first place can help us practice a little bit of empathy. And he also gave me some other nice tips here to really reflect on why the comment was bothersome, but only for a few minutes, right? Don't ruminate and like turn it over in your head. That's not going to make you feel better. But kind of think like, what about this is making me feel a little icky? And then remind yourself that it's unlikely the commenter just decided, I'm going to show them, I'm going to be rude here, right? Like there's probably something going on in their life. Maybe they're frustrated they couldn't figure this out. Maybe this is an ongoing problem. Maybe they're bringing other stuff to this interaction. And I really love this last piece of advice. And I've been practicing it in just kind of my daily life as well, that just silently wish them better circumstances. It can feel a little silly, but it helps shift away from the negative feelings and focus on kindness for both of you in the interaction. So practicing empathy, developing that is always going to make your documentation better. It probably makes you a better person in general. And it can help with some of the concerns and frustrations that can pop up when you're working with customers. All right, on to my last point that you want to be thinking about to effectively embed user feedback into your doc strategy. You will absolutely give comments about gaps in the documentation. That's the whole point. You will get those comments. But you will also get comments that are about gaps the users are noticing in the product. And sometimes those gaps in the product are actually caused by gaps in the org that they might not be aware of. So like Conway's Law, right? Like the organizational structure might be felt in downstream structures as well and communication. And then, the doc teams we found were not immune to this. That I mentioned, we have 16 writers across 2 doc teams, and we found through this process that users were kind of feeling that gap that we have between the 2 doc teams and the silos, and we needed to begin addressing those. So some of the ways that we've been bridging the gap and that have been helpful and productive is that when we get feedback about gaps in the product or the org, we're surfacing that feedback to our PMs, our devs, and our technical program managers. And we've been able to surface enough information that they are actively developing improvements this quarter. And they were working on some improvements last quarter based off of things we've surfaced. And the technical program managers have also reallocated some resources when we were able to say, this area isn't covered thoroughly enough here at the org level, and users are feeling it, and we need to do something. And so that's been a really great way to also raise the profile of us in the org, of showing that we have this deep insight into where users are getting stuck, and we can help with product development. We can help with resource allocation and know how to do that effectively. And then for the docs gaps that we discovered, we started having little coffee tea chats. And this was intended just to kind of build rapport and give us a space to address any confusion that might come up. We noticed that we had shared processes, but different teams, and not a lot of common touch points. And so that meant that any misunderstandings could just linger. So we had our first coffee tea chat. It was really fun. We talked about what punctuation mark we would be, what a biathlon is, and how that came to be. It's kind of bizarre, like skiing and then shooting. We talked about Twin Peaks and Black cinema, and why horses hate Becky. Anyway, the point is I was able to build some rapport and connection with one another that will make it easier to be good supportive colleagues and ensure that our users aren't feeling gaps between our documentation strategies and teams. And when you do that effectively, you can be a hero. This is such an awesome interaction between Graham and Angelo, one of our ambassadors, that Angelo had kind of an ugly workaround that he was using based off of something in the product that wasn't working as well as he needed it to. So Graham was able to surface that to our products and engineering teams. They made the change in the product. We updated the docs, and Angelo got to go, and Angelo called Graham a hero for being able to do that. And this, kind of I mentioned that us going back and being responsive to our users makes them want to give constructive feedback, right? That was something that Jeff said. Then we also have noticed that when we have users calling us heroes and we're able to be heroes to our users, it also makes us as writers want to continue being heroes. We want to go above and beyond and do more for our users to help them be successful. So while still also keeping resources and boundaries and limitations in mind, it's also really great that this has motivated us to continue going as far as we can to help the users and to really ensure that they're having a good experience with our docs and our product. We've been able to build some really lovely relationships with these folks in the community as well that has been really productive and given us better insight and able to build in some of those additional feedback methods. I mentioned interviews and customer calls. We've had some of those since doing the feedback method, and those have been much more productive now because we built relationships with them through multiple comments. So when we are having these one-on-one calls, they are more beneficial and informative than if we were doing them kind of on a cold basis. So you can see this is like creating a really lovely loop of engagement and connection between the writers, our end users, and then we are able to surface what we're discovering. Up to our UI, dev, PM teams to help make improvements. All right, so I've talked a lot, but let me just wrap it all up, okay? So if you are wanting to gather user feedback and effectively embed it into your documentation strategy, these are the 5 things you're going to want to keep in mind. First of all, prioritize maturity. It's always going to pay off, and it will prime you and set you up for success when you're able to gather user feedback. And making sure you're considering team dynamics, concerns, risk tolerance, that all of that plays a big role in how successful you're going to be. And so make sure that any of those concerns are considered throughout the entire process. And that whatever program you build is built on 4 main principles. Evaluation, really understanding what the user needs. Acknowledgement, letting them know they've been heard. Action, whatever that action is, redirecting, making the doc update, letting the dev team know, whatever that is. And then closing the loop, letting the user know they've been heard, action was taken as a result, and that it pays off to comment. And that as you're doing that, you want to make sure that you're supporting evaluation and continuing to manage concerns that writers might have as comments are coming in, managing any of those kind of frustrations, concerns, practicing empathy, that you're minding the gap. That when you notice things that are actually about gaps in the product of the org, you can be a hero to your end user and to the company by helping make those more visible and heard, and it can help make real consistent and productive changes to not just the docs, but the product and the org. All right, thank you all so much for listening.
That's the wrap for today's session. Huge thanks to Rachel for walking us through the topic. I hope the insights shared tonight gave everyone a clearer understanding of how to build and sustain a user feedback system for documentation. To everyone who tuned in, thank you for taking the time to be here and for all your great questions and comments. We'll be sharing the session recording and slides soon, so keep an eye out for that. And of course, if you have more questions or want to learn more about Document360, then feel free to reach out. We'll be back soon with another session soon. See you next time.